330 BC, 20,000 mules and 5,000 camels carried the largest amount of stolen treasure in ancient history out of a single city. Gold, silver, jewels, enough wealth to fund an empire for a generation. But that is not why the Persians remember Alexander. They remember him for what he left behind. Ash. The entire Avesta, the sacred scripture of the world's oldest monotheistic religion, written on prepared cowskins in gold ink, was burned to nothing in a single night. The priests who had memorized the texts were killed. The living libraries of a civilization erased in hours. The Greeks call him Alexander the Great. The Persians call him Alexander the Accursed. And the knowledge he destroyed shaped every religion you practice today. Here is what was lost, and why it still matters. If you want factual investigations into the history that mainstream narratives leave out, subscribe. New cases drop every week. To understand what Alexander destroyed, you need to understand what Persepolis was. It was not just a city. It was the intellectual and spiritual center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Achaemenid Empire, at its peak, stretched from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. 23 nations were under a single administration, and Persepolis was its heart. Construction began around 518 BCE under Darius the Great. Over the next 60 years, successive emperors built what may have been the most ambitious architectural project in human history. The Apadana, the great audience hall, could hold 10,000 people. Its columns stood 20 meters tall. The stairways leading to the terrace were carved with reliefs depicting every nation of the empire bringing tribute, not in defeat, but in dignity. Ethiopians, Indians, Babylonians, Greeks, all represented as equal subjects of a universal order. But it was not the architecture that made Persepolis irreplaceable. It was what was stored inside. The Dinkard, a 9th century Zoroastrian encyclopedia that compiled surviving fragments of older texts, describes what was kept at Persepolis before Alexander arrived. 2 complete copies of the Avesta existed. One was stored in a treasury called the Ganji Hapigan. The other was kept in a fortress archive called the Des-i-Napesht. The Avesta was not a single book. It was an entire library, a comprehensive system of knowledge covering theology, cosmology, astronomy, medicine, law, agriculture, and natural philosophy. According to the Dinkard, the complete Avesta consisted of 21 nasks, volumes organized into 3 groups of 7. The first 7 covered spiritual knowledge, the nature of the universe, the relationship between creator and creation, and the structure of the afterlife. The second 7 covered law and governance, how to organize a just society, resolve disputes, and manage resources. The third 7 covered the natural sciences, medicine, astronomy, botany, and what the texts called the knowledge of the earth and its properties. Here is what makes this significant. Of those 21 nasks, only one survives intact today. The Vendidad, a legal code dealing with purification and the battle against demonic forces. Fragments of 4 or 5 others survive in later compilations. The remaining 15 to 16 nasks are completely lost. We have roughly 1/20th of what the Avesta originally contained. Now, here is where the evidence becomes genuinely disturbing. The knowledge contained in the lost nasks was not primitive, it was advanced. Zoroastrian priests, the Magi, were famous across the ancient world for their expertise in astronomy, medicine, and what the Greeks called natural philosophy. The word magic itself derives from Magi, a testament to how their knowledge appeared to outsiders. The Greek historian Pliny the Elder wrote that the Magi possessed knowledge of the natural world that exceeded anything available in the Greek tradition. Aristotle sent researchers to study under the Magi after Alexander's conquests, an extraordinary admission from a civilization that considered itself culturally superior to everyone else. The Magi maintained an oral tradition alongside written texts. Each priest memorized specific sections of the Avesta and transmitted them generation to generation. This was not casual memorization. Training began in childhood and continued for decades. A fully trained Mobad, a high priest, could recite the entire Avesta from memory. These priests were literally walking libraries. When Alexander's army entered Persepolis, they did not just burn parchment. They killed the people who carried the knowledge in their minds. The Zoroastrian texts describe this explicitly. The destruction was not just physical, it was cognitive. An entire intellectual tradition, transmitted orally for centuries, was severed in a generation. But here's the question that historians have debated for over 2,000 years. Why did Alexander do it? The conventional explanation is that the burning was accidental, or at least impulsive. Ancient Greek sources tell the story of a banquet where Alexander and his companions were drinking heavily. A courtesan named Thais supposedly suggested burning the palace as revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens 150 years earlier. Alexander agreed. The fire was set. The city burned. The next morning, according to Plutarch, Alexander regretted it. But this narrative does not hold up under scrutiny. Archaeological evidence from the site shows that Persepolis was systematically looted before it was burned. The treasury was emptied. Specific buildings were targeted. The fire did not spread randomly. It was set in particular locations. This was not a drunken mistake. It was a military operation. And there is a deeper motive that mainstream history rarely discusses. Alexander was not just conquering territory. He was replacing one civilization's world order with another. The Achaemenid Empire ran on Zoroastrian principles. Asha, truth and cosmic order, was the foundational concept of Persian governance. The king ruled because he upheld truth. The empire existed because it reflected divine order. Alexander could not simply occupy this empire. He had to delegitimize its intellectual foundation. Burning Persepolis, and specifically burning the Avesta, was not vandalism. It was ideological warfare. You cannot rule an empire whose subjects believe their sacred texts contain a higher truth than anything you offer. So you destroy the texts. Here is what most people do not realize about what was actually lost. The Avesta did not just contain religious hymns and prayers. Based on surviving fragments and references in later texts, the lost Nasks contained detailed astronomical observations that tracked planetary movements over centuries. They contained medical knowledge, descriptions of surgical procedures, herbal treatments, and theories about disease transmission that would not appear in European medicine for another 2,000 years. The Bundahishan, a Zoroastrian text compiled from older sources, describes the Earth as a sphere floating in space, held in place by spiritual forces. It describes the planets orbiting the Sun. It categorizes animals and plants into systematic groups that resemble modern taxonomy. These ideas appear in fragments, echoes of a much larger system that no longer exists. The scholar Mary Boyce spent decades studying what could be reconstructed of the lost Avesta. Her conclusion was blunt. The destruction of the complete Avesta represented one of the greatest losses of accumulated knowledge in human history. It was comparable to the burning of the Library of Alexandria. It may have been even greater because the Avesta represented a single, coherent intellectual tradition maintained over at least a millennium. And yet, the knowledge did not disappear entirely. It went underground. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fractured. The Seleucid dynasty took control of Persia, but never fully suppressed Zoroastrianism. The surviving Magi, those who had escaped the massacres, began the painstaking work of reconstructing what they could from memory. The Arsacid dynasty, the Parthians, who overthrew the Seleucids around 247 BCE, actively supported this reconstruction. The Dinkard records that the Parthian government ordered surviving fragments of the Avesta to be collected from every province and compiled into a new edition, but it was incomplete. The priests who had memorized the lost Nasks were dead. Their students were dead. Entire lineages of oral transmission had been severed. What survived was a fraction of the original, reassembled from fragments, cross-referenced against memory, and preserved with desperate care. 4 centuries later, the Sassanid Empire made a second attempt at reconstruction. Under Shapur II in the 4th century CE, Zoroastrian scholars gathered every surviving text, oral tradition, and foreign translation they could find. They compiled the most complete version of the Avesta that would ever exist after Alexander. And then the Arab conquest came, and the cycle of destruction repeated. Here is the pattern that makes this case significant beyond Zoroastrianism. 3 times in recorded history, the accumulated knowledge of the Persian intellectual tradition was deliberately targeted for destruction. Alexander in 330 BCE, the Arab conquest beginning in 633 CE, and the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. Each time, the surviving community preserved what it could and fled. After the Arab conquest, Zoroastrian refugees carried their texts to India. These refugees, the Parsis, maintained the tradition in exile for over 1,000 years. Today, the Parsi community in Mumbai preserves manuscripts that represent the last surviving link to a knowledge system that once spanned from Egypt to India. Some of these manuscripts have never been fully translated. Some contain astronomical calculations that modern scholars are still working to understand. The knowledge Alexander tried to destroy is not entirely gone, but it exists in fragments scattered across museums in London, Paris, Mumbai, and Tehran, partially translated, partially understood, and largely ignored by mainstream academia, which continues to treat Zoroastrianism as a footnote rather than a foundation. There is one final detail that deserves attention. In 2019, researchers at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London used multispectral imaging to examine a Zoroastrian manuscript that had been considered too damaged to read. The imaging revealed text beneath the visible surface, older text that had been scraped off and overwritten, a practice known as palimpsesting. The underlying text contained astronomical calculations that did not match any known Zoroastrian source. Preliminary analysis suggested they were fragments of one of the lost Nasks, scientific knowledge that had been copied, overwritten, and forgotten for centuries. The research team published their initial findings. Then the project went quiet. Funding was not renewed. The manuscript remains in the School of Oriental and African Studies collection. The underlying text has not been fully translated. 2,356 years after Alexander set fire to Persepolis, we are still finding fragments of what he tried to destroy, written on animal skin, hidden beneath later text, preserved by communities who carried them across continents rather than let them disappear. The Greeks call him Alexander the Great because he conquered the known world. The Persians call him Alexander the Accursed because he tried to erase the knowledge that built it. The fire at Persepolis went out in 330 BCE. But a fire in Yazd, Iran, has been burning continuously since 470 CE, maintained by the descendants of the priests Alexander tried to silence. That flame is the oldest continuously burning fire in the world. It has survived conquest, invasion, revolution, and 16 centuries of history. It is still burning today. The case of Alexander and the forbidden knowledge of Persia is not closed. It may never be. The next file is already open,